People say that when you see the woman you are going to marry for the first time, you know it right away. I never believed that. I had spent 29 years watching my father make decisions based on what he felt in his gut, and I had seen where that kind of certainty leads. It leads to a 3-story house built on someone else's grief. It leads to land that is beautiful and wide and quietly wrong in a way you cannot name until you are old enough to stop pretending you do not smell it. So no, I did not believe in knowing things right away. But when I looked through the parlor window of the Vane property on that cool April morning in 1887 and saw a woman working alone in the field while the rest of her family waited inside for me, I understood something immediately. Not that I would marry her, not yet, just that I had been looking at the wrong window for the past hour. My name is Rowan Mercer. My father is August Mercer, the largest landowner in Bitter Creek Valley, Montana Territory. We run cattle and horses on 15,000 acres, and we control the water rights to the main tributary that feeds every smaller ranch in the western half of the valley. I grew up knowing that our name meant something in this county. It took me longer to understand what that something was. I had ridden out to the Vane property that morning because my father asked me to. That is the honest version. The version I told myself was that I went because it was time, because I was 29, and the ranch needed continuity, because August Mercer was coughing blood into his handkerchief every morning now and pretending he was not. Both versions were true. Neither version was the whole truth. The whole truth was that I was tired of being alone in a way I could not admit to anyone, including myself, and so I wrapped that tiredness in practicality and called it responsibility. Franklin Vane met me at the gate with the energy of a man trying very hard to appear calm. He was not calm. He had spent money he did not have on the meeting that morning. I could see it in his coat, freshly pressed and slightly too small across the shoulders, a coat kept in a trunk for occasions that never came. I could see it in the way he gestured toward his house with both hands as though the building might disappear if he did not point at it hard enough. He talked the entire walk from the gate to the front porch. Delia this and Delia that. Delia had been educated in Billings. Delia had a way with guests. Delia understood the social requirements of a family like mine, and was she not just exactly what a man in my position needed beside him? I listened and nodded and looked at the house and thought about nothing in particular. Then I sat down in the parlor and Franklin Vane brought his older daughter in to meet me. Delia Vane was beautiful. That is the plain fact of it, and I will not pretend otherwise. She had her mother's coloring, Franklin told me, and I believed him because it was the one sentence he said that morning that did not feel rehearsed. She sat across from me with her hands folded in her lap and her back perfectly straight, and she answered my questions with the careful precision of someone who had practiced the answers many times. She was composed, she was gracious, and she was trembling slightly in a way that had nothing to do with excitement. I recognized that trembling. I had seen it before in horses brought to the auction yard, animals that had learned to stand very still because stillness was safer than movement. Delia Vane had learned somewhere along the way that stillness was what was required of her, and she had become very good at it. I did not fault her for that. I faulted the people who had taught her. I asked her 2 questions, and she answered both perfectly, and I ran out of things to say. That was when I looked toward the window. The field behind the Vane property ran south toward a line of cottonwood trees, and in the middle of that field, maybe 40 yards from the house, a woman was working a fence line. She had her back to me. She was driving posts with a weight mallet, the kind of work that takes your whole body if you do it right, and she was doing it right. She set her feet wide, she raised the mallet high, she brought it down clean and level without wasted motion. Then she moved to the next post and did it again. She did not know I was watching. That matters. I have spent enough time around people who know they are being observed to understand the difference between performance and presence. The woman in that field was simply there. Fully, completely there. Not arranging herself for anyone, not managing an impression, just working the way you work when the work is the only thing in your mind. I watched her for longer than was polite. Franklin Vane was still talking. I heard my name twice and the word investment once, and I pulled my eyes away from the window and looked at him and said the sentence that changed everything in that room. I said I would like to meet your other daughter. The silence that followed had weight to it. Franklin Vane's face went through 3 different expressions in the span of 2 seconds, and none of them were welcoming. Delia Vane did not look at me. She looked at her hands, and her shoulders, which had been carrying the tension of the entire morning, dropped about an inch. Not in defeat, in something that looked considerably more like relief. Franklin said, "Clara is not really prepared for a meeting of this nature." I said, "That is all right." He said, "She has been working outside all morning. She is not dressed appropriately." I said I did not come here to evaluate a dress. He said finally, with the tone of a man who has run out of reasonable objections and is now reaching for unreasonable ones, "She is not what you are looking for, Mr. Mercer." I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "I have not told you what I am looking for." Delia stood and excused herself quietly. "I think she went to get her sister. I think she did it before Franklin could find a way to stop her, and I think she did it knowing exactly what she was doing. I would not understand the full weight of that action until much later. At the time, I only noticed that when she left the room, she moved faster than she had moved all morning." I waited. Franklin Vane sat across from me and said nothing, and looked at the floor. I had the impression of a man watching something he had built very carefully begin to come apart and being too tired to stop it. Then the door opened. Clara Vane was 22 years old, and she had dirt on her hands and a smear of something across her left forearm, and she stood in the doorway of her family's parlor and looked at me the way you look at a problem you are trying to figure out. Not with hostility, not with welcome, with assessment. The same clear-eyed, practical attention she had been giving the fence posts. I stood up. That surprised her. I could tell by the slight pause before she stepped into the room. She was not what the Valley would have called beautiful. She was something more interesting than that. She had the kind of face that you have to look at twice before you understand it, features that are unremarkable individually and striking together, and eyes that were paying attention to everything. Her hands were calloused. She had braided her hair back tightly, and several strands had come loose, and she had not bothered to fix them. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "You asked to see me." Not a question, a statement. As if she wanted to establish immediately that she had not come of her own choosing, that she was here because she was summoned, and that she thought the distinction mattered. It did matter. I respected it. I said I did. "My name is Rowan Mercer." She said, "I know who you are." She did not say it rudely. She said it the way you say something that is simply factual. Everyone in the Valley knew who the Mercers were. The silence after it carried everything she chose not to add. I said, "Would you sit down?" She looked at the chair. Then she looked at me. Then she sat down, not the careful arranged sitting of her sister, but the direct practical sitting of someone who does not think about the act at all. We talked for 12 minutes. I know it was 12 minutes because I counted later, trying to understand how 12 minutes could have changed the direction of everything. She answered my questions directly. She did not ask any of her own, not because she had none, I could see them behind her eyes, but because she was not yet sure the questions were safe to ask. She told me she had been managing the working side of the Vane property for 4 years. She told me she knew cattle and horses and fence lines and weather. She told me nothing about herself that was not practical and observable. At the end of 12 minutes, I looked at Franklin Vane and said, "I choose Clara." The room did something complicated after that. Franklin Vane made a sound that was not quite a word. Clara went very still. Outside the window, the wind moved through the cottonwood trees, and I could hear it clearly because the room had gone that quiet. And there it was, the thing I had not said. The thing I did not say in the parlor that morning, or on the ride to my ranch, or for the next several weeks. The thing that sat in my chest like a stone the whole time. I had known Clara Vane's name before I walked through that gate. Not from Franklin, not from the Valley gossip that occasionally reached my ears. From a piece of paper I had found 6 months earlier in my father's desk in the bottom drawer beneath a ledger from 1864. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, and written in my father's hand. It had 2 names on it. The first was Thomas Dalloway. The second was Clara Vane, with a date beside it, born November 1864. Beneath both names, in that same careful handwriting, "Settled. Winter 1865. I did not know what settled meant. I did not know who Thomas Dalloway was not then, though the name sat in the back of my mind like a word in a language I almost spoke. I brought the paper to my father and showed it to him, and he looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at me and said, "Burn it." I told him I would. I did not burn it. I had been carrying it in my coat pocket for 6 months when I rode up to the Vane property and looked through a parlor window and saw a woman with that name on a piece of paper doing the work of 3 men alone in a field. I did not know yet what it meant. I did not know yet what I was going to do about it. But I knew that I had chosen correctly for reasons I could not yet explain to anyone, least of all to myself. On the road north toward the Mercer Ranch, with Clara riding beside me in the first of what would become many silences between us, I thought about the last time I had brought someone home. Her name was Vera. She had come to the valley from St. Louis to visit her cousin, and she had the kind of intelligence and warmth that made a room feel larger when she entered it. We were engaged for 4 months. Then her cousin told her about the water dispute about the families who had lost crops when August Mercer redirected the tributary about the Hollis Ranch that had sold at a loss after 2 dry seasons, and the Pembridge family that had packed up and left the valley entirely. Vera came to me and asked me directly if it was true. I told her it was true that my father made his own decisions and had for as long as I could remember, that I did not agree with all of them. She left the following week. She was not cruel about it. She was honest, which in some ways was harder. She said she did not think she could build a life on ground that had been taken from other people. I understood her reasoning. I could not argue against it. What I had not told her, what I had never told anyone, was that I agreed with her, that I had been living with that agreement for years quietly without knowing what to do with it, that I had grown up on land that was beautiful and generous, and mine and I had spent my adult life trying to be worthy of it in a way my father had never needed to try, and I was not sure I had succeeded. Clara said nothing for the first hour of the ride. The afternoon light came down through the pines along the ridge, and the valley opened up below us, and I watched her take it in the space of it the scale. Her face gave nothing away, but her eyes moved carefully across the landscape, the way you look at something you are trying to understand rather than simply see. I said, "The Mercer Ranch is another 40 minutes north." She said, "I know where it is." I said, "Have you been out this way before?" She said, "I have ridden the fence line on this side of our property every summer since I was 16. Your land starts about 2 miles east of that ridge." She said your land in a tone I could not quite read. Not bitter, not resentful, simply accurate. I said, "Yes, it does." She did not say anything after that. Neither did I. The horses moved at an easy pace through the late afternoon, and I thought about the piece of paper in my coat pocket, and the name Thomas Dalloway, and the word settled, and all the things I did not yet know how to say. The Mercer Ranch comes into view from the top of a long rise about a mile north of Bitter Creek, and I have watched many people see it for the first time. There is usually a pause, usually a particular kind of intake of breath. The property is significant by any measure: 3-story house, bunkhouse, 2 barns, the eastern pastures running all the way to the tree line, and in the April light it was at its best, the grass coming in green and the creek catching the last of the afternoon sun. Clara Vane looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at me and said, "It is bigger than it needs to be." She said it without judgment, just observation. I almost laughed. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to me about my home in years. I said my father would agree. He built it that way on purpose. She said most people who build things too large are trying to fill something up. I did not answer that, but I thought about it for the rest of the evening. Hattie was waiting on the front steps. She had been running the Mercer household for 30 years, since before I was born, and she had the particular authority of a person who has outlasted everyone who ever tried to dismiss her. She was 63 years old, and she moved like a woman of 40, and she saw things that most people missed entirely. When I had ridden in with Vera 3 years ago, Hattie had shaken her hand and smiled and said nothing to me that evening. Later she told me, "She is lovely, Rowan, but she is looking for something this valley cannot give her." She had been right. I had not thanked her for it. Now Hattie stood on the steps and watched Clara dismount with the economical grace of someone who has been climbing on and off horses her entire life, and I watched Hattie's face as she took Clara in. The assessment was quick and thorough. Hattie's eyes moved from Clara's hands to her boots to her face, and then something happened in Hattie's expression that I had not seen before. Something that was not quite recognition, but was in the neighborhood of it. Something that drew her up short. She said quietly enough that she might not have meant me to hear Lord above. "She looks like her." Clara did not hear it. She was handing her reins to one of the stable hands. I heard it clearly. I did not ask Hattie who she meant. I filed the words away in the place where I was keeping the paper from my father's desk, and the name Thomas Dalloway, and all the other things that were accumulating around the edges of a truth I had not yet reached the center of. My father was in his study. August. Mercer had been a large man once, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of physical presence that made people step back slightly when he entered a room. The illness had been taking that from him for 2 years. He was still tall, still upright when he made the effort, but there was a hollowness to him now, a quality of thinning as though he was being slowly removed from the inside. He was 61 years old and looked 70. He looked up when we came in. He looked at me first the way he always did, making sure I was the same person who had left that morning, and then he looked at Clara. He did not speak for a long moment. Clara met his gaze without flinching. She did not introduce herself. She did not fill the silence with accommodation. She simply stood in the doorway of his study and looked back at him with the same clear, patient attention she had given everything else that day. August said, "You are the younger one." Clara said, "I am Clara Vane, yes." August said, "Your father told me you were not suitable." Clara said, "My father told you whatever was useful to him." Another silence. August looked at me. His expression was complicated in a way I could not fully read, which was unusual. I had learned my father's face over 29 years, but what was in it at that moment was something I had not seen before and could not name. He said to me, "Take her to the East Room. I will speak with her tomorrow." That was all. He looked back down at his desk. Clara and I were dismissed. In the hallway, Hattie materialized, as she had a way of doing, and walked us to the East Wing without speaking. She opened the door to the guest room, which was large and had a window looking out over the southern pasture, and she set down the lamp and turned to leave. Then she stopped. She said to Clara, but with her eyes on the middle distance, "I am glad you are here. There are things in this house that have needed someone like you for a long time." She went out and closed the door. Clara looked at the room for a moment. Then she looked at me. She said, "What did she mean by that?" I said, "I do not know yet." She said, "But you think you are going to find out?" I said, "Yes." She studied me for a moment the way she had studied me all day, that same direct measuring attention, and then she said, "Mr. Mercer, why did you choose me? And I want the honest answer, not the one that is designed to make me feel better about being here." I looked at her for a long moment. The lamp was behind her, and her face was in partial shadow, and I thought about 6 months of carrying a piece of paper and a name and a question I had not known how to ask. I thought about a word settled. I thought about a man named Thomas Dalloway, whose name sat in my pocket right now like a coal I had been holding for too long. I said, "There are things I need to tell you, not tonight, but soon, and I want you to hear them from me before you hear them from anyone else." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not with fear, with the look of someone cataloging information. She said, "That is not an answer to my question." I said, "No. It is a promise that there will be one." She looked at me for another moment. Then she said, "All right. Good night, Mr. Mercer." I went to my room and did not sleep for a long time. I took the paper from my coat pocket and spread it on the writing desk and looked at it in the lamplight. The handwriting was my father's. The names were clear. Clara Vane, born November 1864, Thomas Dalloway. And beneath them both, in that neat, deliberate script, settled, winter 1865. I thought about what my father might mean by settled. I thought about the several meanings of that word in the vocabulary of men like August Mercer, men who dealt in land and water, and the kind of agreements that were never written into contracts because they were not the kind of agreements anyone wanted to be able to prove. Settled could mean concluded. It could mean resolved. It could mean ended. Thomas Dalloway. I said the name quietly in the silent room. Thomas Dalloway. Somewhere in the back of my memory something moved. Not a clear thought. A shape. The shape of a conversation I had half heard as a child, words between my father and one of the older ranch hands, a name spoken and then not spoken again. I had been carrying this paper for 6 months. I had looked at it dozens of times. I had told myself I would find out what it meant before I did anything with the information. And then when my father sent me to the Vane property to choose a wife from among Franklin Vane's daughters, I had gone and I had looked through a window and I had understood something I could not yet put into language. What I understood was this: whatever had happened between my father and Thomas Dalloway had created a woman in a field who drove fence posts alone while her family prepared to barter her off, and who looked at the world with the eyes of someone who had learned not to expect anything from it. And I understood in a way I could not have explained to anyone that I was not going to be another man in that woman's life who knew the shape of what had been done to her and said nothing. I owed her a truth I had not yet fully assembled, but I owed it to her. That much I knew. I folded the paper and put it back in my pocket. Outside the window, the Mercer Ranch lay dark and enormous under the Montana sky, 15,000 acres of the most productive land in the valley, watered by a tributary that my father had taken for himself and held for 22 years. In the barn below, horses shifted and breathed. On the ridge to the north, the fence line I had ridden 1,000 times marked the edge of what we claimed as ours. I thought about Clara Vane sleeping somewhere in the east wing of this house, a woman who had come here because she had no real choice, carrying whatever she carried from a childhood I did not yet know the details of. I thought about what she had said on the ride north, the matter-of-fact precision of it. Most people who build things too large are trying to fill something up. I thought about my father's face when he looked at her, that unreadable, complicated expression I had not seen before. I thought about Hattie's voice. She looks like her. All of these things were connected. I could feel the shape of the connection without yet being able to see it clearly, the way you can feel the outline of something buried when you press your hand against the earth above it. I sat at that desk in the lamplight with the sounds of the sleeping ranch around me and the paper in my pocket, and the particular loneliness of a man who has been carrying a secret that does not entirely belong to him, and I thought, I have to tell her. Whatever it costs, and however incomplete the telling has to be right now, she has to know that I came to her with more knowledge than a stranger should have had. She has to know before she trusts me further that my choice was not as simple as she thinks. I fell asleep in the chair sometime after midnight. In the morning I found Clara already in the barn. She had risen before the ranch hands located the tack room, identified the mare with the loose shoe that Silas had noted the day before and had not yet gotten to, and she was in the process of examining the hoof with the calm competence of someone who had done this 1,000 times. She did not hear me come in. I stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. The morning light came through the high window above the stall and landed across her shoulders and the bent line of her back. She spoke to the horse in a low, even voice. Not words exactly, just sound, the kind of reassurance that animals understand and most people forget how to give. I said, "You are up early." She said without looking up, "The shoe is not quite loose enough to come off, but it will be by tomorrow if Silas does not get to it today." I said, "I will tell him." She set the hoof down and straightened and turned to look at me. In the morning light she looked different than she had the evening before. Not softer exactly. More settled in herself. As though she had taken the measure of this new place overnight and reached some quiet conclusion about how to proceed. She said, "You meant what you said last night, about telling me something?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then tell me over breakfast. I have not eaten since yesterday noon." We walked to the kitchen and I found bread and eggs and I made coffee while she sat at the table and did not try to help, which told me she understood that this was a conversation that needed a particular kind of space. Hattie came in and saw us and went back out again without a word, which told me Hattie understood the same thing. I put the food on the table and sat down across from Clara, and I took the paper from my coat pocket and I smoothed it out between us on the table. I watched her eyes move to it. I watched her read it. I watched her read it again. When she looked up at me, her face had the quality I would come to know well over the following weeks, the expression she wore when she was thinking something through completely before she allowed herself to react to it. Careful, contained, but not cold. She said, "Thomas Dalloway." I said, "Yes." She said, "You know that name?" I said, "I found that paper in my father's desk 6 months ago. I have not told him I kept it. He told me to burn it." She said, "And instead you came to my father's house and chose me." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What does settled mean?" I said, "I do not know yet, but I intend to find out. And I wanted you to know that I am looking for that answer before I found it anywhere else." She looked at me for a long time. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window now, and outside I could hear the ranch beginning its day, the sounds of men and horses, and the particular productive noise of a large property waking up. Clara Vane sat across from me at my kitchen table with a piece of paper between us that connected her in ways neither of us yet understood to my father, and to a name that was also, though I did not know this, yet the name of her blood. She said, "Why are you telling me this?" I said, "Because I think you have been around enough people who knew things and chose not to say them. And I do not want to be another one of those people." She looked at the paper again. Then she looked at me. Then she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, "That is either the bravest thing anyone has said to me or the beginning of something very complicated." I said, "Probably both." She picked up her coffee. Outside, one of the ranch hands called to another across the yard, and a horse answered, and the morning went on around us the way mornings do, indifferent to the weight of what was sitting quietly between two people at a kitchen table. I thought about the shape of the connection I could feel but not yet see. I thought about Sheriff Cord Dalloway, who had been watching the Mercer Ranch for 3 years with the patience of a man who is waiting for the right moment. I thought about Hattie's face when she saw Clara. I thought about my father's expression in the study. I thought we are at the beginning of something. I do not know yet where it ends. But for the first time in a long time I am not trying to keep the ground from shifting under my feet. I am trying to understand what is beneath it. That felt like a different kind of standing, a truer kind. I did not know yet what it would cost, but I was beginning to believe it would be worth it. The first 14 days at the Mercer Ranch were a kind of education I had not anticipated giving or receiving. I had expected resistance. I had expected Clara to move through the property with the careful, contained energy of someone trying not to take up too much space the way people move in houses that are not yet theirs, touching nothing, claiming nothing, waiting to be told where the edges are. I had seen it before in hired hands who came from difficult situations. That particular quality of smallness that people wear when they have learned that making yourself visible leads to consequences. Clara Vane did not do that. She observed for 1 full day. I watched her do it from a distance the way she walked the perimeter of the working yard in the morning, noting the layout, the distances between buildings, the patterns of movement among the hands. She spoke to no one that first day except to answer direct questions. She did not offer opinions. She simply looked with those clear and patient eyes at everything there was to see. On the second day, she went to Silas. Silas had been managing the working operations of the Mercer Ranch for 11 years. He was a quiet man, deliberate in his speech, with the particular dignity of someone who has earned his position entirely through competence and has never needed to announce it. He was also, I should say, not an easy man to approach. He had a way of receiving people that was not unfriendly but was not warm either, a kind of neutral assessment that most newcomers found uncomfortable enough to avoid. Clara walked up to him while he was going over the morning's work orders and said, "The northeast pasture fence has 3 sections that will not hold through a wet spring. I noticed them yesterday on my walk. If you want, I can show you which ones." Silas looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Show me." She showed him. He asked 2 questions. She answered both correctly. He nodded once and said, "I will get the materials together this afternoon." She said, "I can start in the morning if you want a second set of hands." He said, "Come at first light." That was the whole conversation. But I saw something in Silas's expression afterward that I had not seen there in 11 years of working alongside him. Something that was the closest he ever came to being impressed. I watched all of this from the barn door and said nothing, and felt something shifting quietly in my understanding of what I had brought home. The days took on a rhythm. Clara worked beside Silas and the other hands with a consistency and precision that needed no commentary. She asked questions when she did not know something and never asked the same question twice. She made no attempt to be liked. She made no attempt to be tolerated. She simply did the work fully and without theater and left the matter of opinion to everyone else. At night, I would find her at the kitchen table after supper, sometimes with a small notebook, sometimes with nothing, sitting in the particular stillness of someone who is thinking rather than resting. We talked on some of those evenings, not long conversations, not intimate ones, but the kind of talk that builds something over time without announcing that it is doing so. She asked me about the history of the land. I told her what I knew, which was more than most people and less than I would have liked. She asked about the water rights. I told her that my father held controlling access to the main tributary. I told her the other ranches in the Western Valley depended on his goodwill for their water in dry years. I told her this carefully, watching her face as I did. She said, "And has he been good-willed?" I said, "He has been consistent," which is not exactly the same thing. She looked at me for a moment and then looked back at the table and said, "No, it is not." I did not tell her yet about Sheriff Cord Dalloway. I did not tell her yet about the 3 years of investigation, the quiet and patient circling of a man who was looking for something specific enough that he had not yet found the right angle of approach. I told myself I was waiting until I had more of the picture assembled. The truth, which I was not ready to look at directly, was that I was waiting because I did not yet know how to explain to Clara Vane that the man who had been systematically pursuing my father for 3 years shared a surname with the name on the paper in my coat pocket. I was carrying several things at once, and I had not yet found a way to set any of them down. On the 14th evening I could not sleep. This was not unusual. I had not been sleeping well for months, since before Clara arrived, since long before I found the paper in my father's desk. The particular insomnia of a man who has questions he cannot answer, and too much time in the dark to sit with them. I went to the barn because that is where I go when the house feels too full of the weight of what is unresolved. Clara was already there. She was sitting in the far corner of the barn in the clean straw against the wall with a small notebook on her knees. Not writing, just holding it. One of the mares had been restless earlier, and the barn still had that quality of recent attention. Lantern light still burning low on the post, the horses calm now but not fully settled. She did not hear me come in. I stopped in the doorway, and for a moment I simply stood there, aware that I was observing something that was not meant for observation. There was a quality to her stillness that was different from her working stillness. This was not the stillness of someone preparing to act. This was the stillness of someone who was somewhere very far inside themselves, somewhere they had gone to be alone in a way that had nothing to do with the physical space around them. I made a sound crossing the threshold, and she looked up, and the distance in her eyes shortened immediately the way a lamp brightens when you adjust the wick. I said, "Could not sleep." She said, "The roan was uneasy earlier. I came to check on her. I looked at the roan, who was sleeping comfortably. I said, 'She seems all right now.' Clara said, 'She does.'" Neither of us moved. The barn held its nighttime sounds around us, the breathing of horses, the small settlings of wood, the distant sound of wind against the roof. I sat down on an overturned feed bucket about 8 feet from where she was, not beside her, nearby. After a while I said, "What is in the notebook?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mother's handwriting. She gave it to me before she died. I have been carrying it for 4 years without reading most of it." I said, "Why not read it?" She said, "Because I am not sure what I will find. And I am not yet sure I am strong enough to find it and keep going at the same time." I looked at her. She was looking at the notebook, not at me. In the low lamplight, she looked younger than 22 and older than 22 simultaneously, which is the look of someone who has carried adult weight since they were a child. I said, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "You can ask." I said, "Have you ever wanted something for yourself? Not because someone needed you to have it, not because it would be useful, just because you wanted it." She was quiet for long enough that I thought she might not answer. Then she said I wanted to know who my father was, my real father. My mother would not tell me. She said it was for my protection, but I think it was for hers, and now she is gone and I cannot ask her. She said it without drama, without self-pity, the flat precision of a fact that has been lived with long enough to lose its jagged edges. I said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not diminish it. After a while she said, "What about you?" I said I want to build something I am not ashamed of. That sounds simple, but it has been the hardest thing I have ever tried to do. She looked at me then, and the expression on her face was one I had not seen from her before. Not quite soft, but open, the way a door looks when it has been unlocked but not yet pushed. She said, "Your father." I said, "Yes." She said, "You love him anyway." I said, "He is my father." She said, "That is not the same as yes." I thought about it. I said, "It is the best I have." We sat in the barn until the roan shifted in her stall and sighed the long, satisfied sigh of a sleeping horse, and then Clara stood and said good night and walked back to the house. And I sat in the barn for a while longer, thinking about the particular shape of what was building between us, careful and slow, and made of the kind of honest attention that is rarer and more durable than affection. I thought I have not been this close to someone in 3 years. I thought I have not wanted to be. I thought I have to tell her everything I know, before she finds out from somewhere else. On my way back through the house that night, I passed Hattie in the hallway. She was putting out the lamps, the last task she did every night before bed, something she had done for 30 years without being asked. She did not look up when I passed, but she said quietly to the lamp she was tending, "There is a woman I have been meaning to bring to this house for a long time. I have been waiting until I was sure the house could hold what she carries." She turned down the wick. "I think we are getting close." She went down the hall before I could ask her what she meant. The following morning I went looking for Silas. I found him at the water trough behind the north barn, checking the intake pipe that ran down from the tributary. I told him I needed to talk. He set down his tools and gave me his full attention in the way he always did, without performance or impatience. I told him about the paper. I told him the name Thomas Dalloway. I told him I had kept it against my father's wishes for 6 months, and I needed to know if Silas knew anything about that name. Silas was quiet for a long time after I finished, long enough that the water ran and the birds moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, and a cloud passed over the sun and came back. Then he said, "Where did you hear that name?" I said. "My father's desk." He said, "Rowan. I am going to tell you something that I have not told another soul in 22 years. And I am going to tell you because I think you are the right person to have it, and because I think it is almost too late to have it be useful if we wait much longer." I said, "Tell me." He said, "Thomas Dalloway was a good man. He owned a quarter section south of here, ran a small cattle operation, had a wife and a child on the way when I knew him. He and your father were partners once, years before you were old enough to remember. They bought the water rights to the tributary together. The two of them split even down the middle. Thomas wanted to set up a cooperative arrangement with the smaller ranches, let everyone in the Western Valley draw from the main channel in dry years. Your father did not want that. He wanted the exclusive control. They argued about it for a year." Silas paused. He picked up a small stone from the ground beside the trough and turned it in his fingers. He said, "In January of 1865, Thomas Dalloway had an accident. He was found at the bottom of the eastern ravine. His horse was found nearby. Everyone said it was a fall. I said, 'You do not think it was a fall.' Silas said, 'I do not know what it was.' I know that 2 weeks later your father had sole ownership of the water rights. I know that Thomas's wife left the valley before the ground thawed with their infant daughter, and that your father paid for that departure out of his own account. I know the name he wrote in that ledger and what he meant by settled, even if he never said it out loud. He set the stone down carefully with the deliberate care of a man setting down something much heavier. He said, "The infant daughter's name was Clara." The morning went very still around me. The water ran in the trough. The cottonwoods moved. I stood beside Silas and felt 22 years of unasked questions find their answer in the space of a sentence. Clara Vane, born November 1864, daughter of Thomas Dalloway. Brought up under a different name by a man who had been paid to take her mother and disappear. I said, "Does she know?" Silas said, "I do not believe she knows anything. I believe her mother died with the secret. I believe Franklin Vane kept it because it was worth keeping." I said, "Sheriff Dalloway." Silas looked at me. I said, "Cord Dalloway. He has been investigating my father for 3 years." Silas closed his eyes briefly. Then he said Thomas had a younger brother. I did not know he had become the law. I stood at the water trough with the weight of everything pressing down from above and below, simultaneously from the history in the ground and the present walking around inside my house, and I thought she asked me who her father was. And I know, and she does not. I said to Silas, "Not a word of this to anyone." "Not yet." He said, "Rowan, you have to tell her." I said, "I know. I am going to." 3 days after my conversation with Silas, Sheriff Cord Dalloway rode up to the Mercer Ranch on a Tuesday morning with the careful, unhurried manner of a man who has been preparing for a visit for a long time and has finally decided the time has arrived. I was in the yard when he came through the gate. Clara was 50 yards behind me near the fence line she had been repairing with Silas since early morning. She had not yet seen him. I had a window of perhaps 30 seconds in which I could meet him before he saw her, and I used it. I walked out and said, "Sheriff, what can I do for you?" Dalloway was a man of about 55, lean through the face with deep-set eyes that had the quality of permanently focused attention. He had the weathered, settled look of someone who has spent decades outdoors in all conditions, not uncomfortable in any of them. He dismounted without hurry and shook my hand with the grip of someone who is not trying to prove anything. He said, "Routine check on the water intake permits. I need to look at the documentation for the tributary access." I said, "I can get those from my father's office." He said, "I appreciate that." He was looking past me. I knew this before I turned around. I turned anyway. Clara had stopped working. She was standing at the fence line with a post driver in her hands, looking toward the gate with the focused attention she brought to everything unfamiliar. At this distance I could not read her expression. I could see Dalloway's face clearly enough. He was looking at her the way you look at something that does not compute, that requires a second examination, that calls up something from a part of your memory you have not visited in a long time. He said almost to himself, "Who is that?" I said, "My wife, Clara Mercer, formerly Vane." He said nothing for a moment. He kept looking. I watched something move behind his eyes, a complicated internal weather recognition pressing against a framework that was not built to receive it. He said, "How long has she been at the ranch?" I said. "About 3 weeks." He said, "Franklin Vane's daughter." I said, "Yes." He turned back to me. His face had settled into the professional stillness of a man who has learned to control what shows. But his jaw was set in a way that told me he was working harder than usual at the control. He said, "I will need to see those documents." I took him inside. I showed him the water rights documentation. He reviewed it with the thoroughness of someone who has reviewed it before and is checking for something specific, something he has not found yet in previous examinations, but has not stopped believing is there. He asked 3 questions, all precise, all pointed toward the same quiet destination. I answered them honestly, which was easier than it might have been a month ago, because Clara's presence in my house had been doing something to my relationship with evasion that I was still in the process of understanding. He left without incident. Clara watched him ride out through the gate from the fence line. Then she went back to work. That evening she found me on the front porch after supper. She sat down in the other chair without being asked and looked out at the darkening pasture and said, "Who is he?" I said, "Sheriff Cord Dalloway. He has been looking into my father's land and water dealings for about 3 years. She said, "Do you know what he is looking for?" I said, "I have a good idea. Yes." She turned to look at me. The evening light was behind her and I could see her face clearly. She said, "Rowan, how much do you know that you have not told me yet?" It was not an accusation. It was the tone of someone who has been patient for a reasonable period and is now putting the question on the table between them where it belongs. I said, "More than I should have held on to this long." She said, "Then tell me." I said, "Not tonight. There are pieces I am still assembling and I do not want to tell you a partial truth. A partial truth is just a more comfortable kind of lie." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right. But Rowan, whatever it is, I have been managing difficult information my entire life. You do not need to protect me from it." I said, "I know that. What I need is to be sure that when I tell you I am telling you everything, not just the parts I have found yet. There is a difference between protecting you and protecting the integrity of what I owe you." She looked at me steadily. Then she said, "You owe me honesty. You said that in the kitchen on our second morning here." I said I meant it then. I mean it more now. She stood up. She looked out at the land for a moment, the vast dark shape of it spreading away from the porch in every direction, 15,000 acres of complicated history lying quiet under the Montana stars. She said, "My mother left me a notebook. I told you I had not read most of it." I said, "Yes." She said, "I read it last night." She did not say anything more. She went inside. I sat on the porch for a long time after that, looking at the same land she had been looking at, thinking about what a woman who had spent 4 years not reading her mother's words might find when she finally read them, and whether what she found had a name she was already starting to recognize. The following morning Clara did not come to breakfast. Hattie knocked on her door at 7 and came back to the kitchen with the expression of someone receiving a message they do not want to deliver. She said she is awake. She says she needs some time. I said, "Give her time." Silas came in at 8 and looked at me and I shook my head slightly, and he sat down and had coffee without speaking. At 10 o'clock Clara came into the kitchen. She had been crying. Not recently the eyes were dry, but the particular quality of stillness she was carrying told me she had been somewhere that had required everything she had, and she was just now coming back from it. She sat down at the table and I put coffee in front of her and sat across from her and waited. She said, "My mother wrote about a man named Thomas Dalloway." I said, "Yes." She said she wrote that he was her husband, before Franklin Vane, that she had a daughter with him, and that after he died she left the valley because a man with money paid her to leave and keep quiet. She wrote that the man with money was August Mercer. I said, "Yes." She looked at me. She said, "You knew this." I said, "I knew the shape of it. Silas told me the details 3 days ago. I have been trying to find the right way to tell you, and I have been taking too long, and I am sorry for that." She was quiet. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at the table, and I watched her process it, the way she processed everything from the inside out, not letting it show until she had understood it. She said Thomas Dalloway was my father. I said, "Yes. That is what I believe." She said, "And your father knew. He knew who I was when he arranged this marriage." I said, "I do not know if he knew precisely. I believe he knew enough. I believe the paper I found in his desk with your name on it was not a coincidence. Whether he sent me to your family's property because of what he knew, or whether he was trying to do something about what he had done, I cannot tell you that yet because I have not asked him." She said, "I want to ask him." I said, "I know." She said, "And the sheriff, Dalloway." I said, "Thomas had a younger brother. His name was Cord. He became the law in this county about 5 years ago. He has been investigating my father ever since." Clara set down the coffee cup. She looked at me for a long time without speaking. I let her look. I did not try to fill the silence or manage her reaction or get ahead of whatever was forming behind her eyes. She said, "You chose me because of this, because you found that paper and you knew who I was." I said, "I chose you because when I looked through that window and saw you working in that field, I saw someone who was real in a way I had not been around in a very long time. That is true, and it came first. But I also came to your father's property knowing your name, and you deserved to know that from the beginning, and I did not tell you on the first day, and I am telling you now, and I am not asking you to be all right with the way I handled it. I am just telling you the truth of it." She looked at me for a long time after that. The kitchen was quiet around us. Outside the window the ranch was going through its mourning, and the ordinary sounds of it came through horses and hands and the distant call of someone crossing the yard, the ongoing life of a place that did not pause for the weight of what was being held at a kitchen table inside it. She said, "Who else knows?" I said, "Silas." "Hattie, I believe, has known for years and chosen not to speak. My father knows what he did. Whether he knows who you are specifically, I do not know yet." She said, "I need to talk to your father." I said, "Yes." She said, "And I need to talk to the sheriff." I said, "Yes." She said, "Not today." I said, "Whenever you are ready." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that I have thought about many times since, in the way you return to sentences that land somewhere deep and stay. She said, "I spent my whole life feeling like I was standing outside a room where important things were being decided about me, like I could see through the glass but could not get through the door." She paused. "And now I find out the room I was looking into was built on top of my own history, that the glass I was pressing my face against was made out of something that was already mine." She picked up the coffee cup. She drank. She set it down with the precision of someone who is keeping all their movements deliberate, because the alternative is to let the steadiness go entirely. She said, "All right. What do we do now?" I said, "We find out the rest of it, all of it, and we do not do it alone." She looked at me. She said, "You are not what I expected." I said, "What did you expect?" She said, "Another man who would know things and choose not to say them." I said, "I almost was." She said, "But you were not." I said, "Not today." She almost smiled. It was small and brief and gone almost before I was sure I had seen it. But it was there. I thought we are at the beginning of something. I thought whatever this costs, it is worth it. I thought about Vera leaving 3 years ago because she could not build on ground that had been taken from other people. And I thought about the ground I was standing on now, ground that had been taken, ground that needed to be returned, ground that could not be what it should be until the people who had been removed from it were given back what was rightfully theirs. I thought about a woman who had spent her whole life pressing her face against glass. I thought, I am going to open the door, whatever is on the other side of it. The afternoon of that day, without planning to, we ended up riding the northern fence line together. Not because either of us proposed it, because Silas mentioned at noon that the crews were short-handed up north, and we both stood up at the same time, and neither of us acknowledged the coincidence. We rode for an hour without much conversation. The land was at its best in early afternoon, the light coming down at an angle that made the grass look almost gold. The mountains to the north still holding their winter snow at the peaks, while the valley below had gone completely to spring. The creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, visible in flashes through the cottonwoods. The water that was at the center of everything, the water my father had held for 22 years, the water that had been promised to be shared by a man who died before he could share it. Clara was riding beside me, and she was looking at the creek. She said, "It is beautiful water." I said, "Yes." She said, "Water like that does not belong to one person." I said, "No, it does not." She turned to look at me. She said, "Are you going to give it back?" I said, "I am going to do what should have been done 22 years ago." "Yes." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the view and said nothing more, and we rode along the fence line in the warm April afternoon while the creek caught the light through the trees, and I thought about what it means to inherit something you did not earn, and what it costs to return it, and whether the cost is really a cost at all when you understand what you are buying with it. That evening a letter arrived for Clara from her sister Delia. She read it at the kitchen table and then folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her shirt and looked out the window for a moment. Then she said, "My sister has taken up baking." I said, "Is that unusual?" She said Delia has never done anything in her life because she wanted to. She has only done things because she was supposed to. She paused. She says she has been doing it every morning since I left, that it is the first thing she has done in years that belongs entirely to her. I said, "How does that make you feel?" Clara was quiet. Then she said, "Like something I did without meaning to do, it opened a door for someone else. I do not know what to do with that." I said, "Maybe you just let it be what it is." She looked at me. She said, "Is that what you do?" I said, "I am learning to." She looked at the folded letter in her pocket. Then she looked at me. She said, "Rowan, when this is all resolved, whatever it looks like on the other side of it, I want you to know that I am not here because I had no choice. I mean, I did not have a choice when I came, but I am staying because I choose to, and that is different." I said, "I know the difference." She said, "Good." Outside, the last of the daylight was going off the mountains and the valley was settling into the particular blue of a Montana spring evening. The ranch made its end-of-day sounds around us, the hands coming in from the fields, the horses being settled for the night, the ordinary closing rhythm of a working property. And somewhere in the county, Sheriff Cord Dalloway was sitting in his office with 22 years of unanswered questions, not knowing that the answer to the most important one of them was sitting at a kitchen table 8 miles north, learning how to want things for herself for the very first time. I thought it is almost time. The weight of everything that has been withheld for so long was reaching the point where silence was no longer protection. It was pressure, the kind that builds until something gives. I thought about going to my father tomorrow. I thought about what I would say when I got there. I thought about Clara's voice in the barn 2 weeks ago. Most people who build things too large are trying to fill something up. I thought about what my father had been trying to fill, and what it had cost him, and what it had cost everyone around him, and whether it was too late for any of it to mean something different than it had meant for 22 years. I folded my hands on the table and looked at the woman across from me and thought, we are at the edge of the hard part. We have been walking toward it since the day I did not burn that paper. Since the day I looked through a window and saw someone who was real. We were going in, together. That had to be enough to start with. It was. I went to my father the next morning, not because I had a plan fully assembled, not because I knew exactly how the conversation would go, or what he would say, or how much of it I could control. I went because Clara had said she wanted to talk to him, and I understood without her having to explain it that she should not have to walk into that room without knowing I had already been there, that she should not have to be the one who opens the door to a truth that was kept from her. I wanted to open it first, not to protect her from it, to make sure it was open wide enough that she could walk through without having to force it. August was in his study at 7 in the morning, which meant he had not slept well, which meant the coughing had been bad again in the night. He was sitting behind his desk with a cup of coffee gone cold at his elbow and a ledger open in front of him that he was not reading. He was looking at the window. The morning light came through it at a low angle and caught the dust in the air and made the room look older than it was. He heard me come in and did not turn around. He said, "Close the door." I closed it. He said, "Sit down." I sat. He turned from the window and looked at me with the eyes of a man who has been waiting for a particular conversation for a long time and is not sure whether the waiting ending is a relief or the beginning of something worse. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the sleepless night. He looked tired the way people look when they have been carrying something for decades and the weight of it has finally become structural part of how they hold themselves, inseparable from the posture. I put the paper on his desk, the one I had not burned. He looked at it for a moment without touching it. He did not ask how I still had it. He had known, I think, from the day he told me to burn it, and watched my face not quite complete the agreement that I had not done it. He said, "How much do you know?" I said, "Enough." Silas told me the rest. August nodded slowly. He picked up the paper and looked at it, and the look on his face was one I recognized from my childhood, The look he wore when he was doing calculations, weighing things against each other, finding the most defensible position. Then something changed in it. The calculation stopped. What replaced it was something rawer and quieter, something that had been underneath the calculation for 22 years waiting. He set the paper down. He said I did not have him killed. I said I know that. He said I want that to be clear before anything else is said in this room. I said it is clear. But you knew who did it, and you made a choice about what to do with that knowledge, and that choice took a man's life away from his family in a way that cannot be separated from you just because you did not give the order directly. He looked at me. He said, "You sound like your mother." I said, "Good." A long silence. Outside the study window, the ranch was coming to life in the early morning, the sounds of it familiar and ordinary, and entirely unchanged by what was happening in this room. I thought about how strange that was, how the world keeps its rhythm, regardless of what shifts inside the walls of a single room, inside a single house. August said, "Her name." I said, "Clara." He said, "Thomas's daughter." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a long time after that. I let him be quiet. I did not try to move him through it faster than he could go. This was not a conversation that should be rushed, and I had learned enough from the last several weeks to understand the difference between patience and avoidance. He said I paid Catherine Vane to leave. I paid Franklin Vane to take her in, give her daughter a name, keep quiet. He paused. I told myself I was protecting them, that the valley was not safe for Thomas's widow after what had happened, that they were better off somewhere new, with a new name, with money enough to start over. I said, "Did you believe that when you told it to yourself?" He looked at the window. He said I believed parts of it. I said, "And the parts you did not believe?" He was quiet. Then he said, "I believed that I was also protecting myself, that the two things could exist at the same time without one canceling out the other. I have spent 22 years believing that." I said, "And now?" He turned from the window and looked at me with the direct, undefended gaze of someone who has stopped trying to manage the impression they make. He looked old. He looked sick. He looked more than anything like a man who is running out of time to be the person he should have been earlier. He said, "I want to speak to her." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I had not expected him to say, something that told me the accounting he was doing went further back than I had realized. He said I knew. When Franklin Vane came to me last year asking to include his daughters in a marriage arrangement, I knew the younger one's name. I had written it down myself 22 years ago, and I had never been able to forget it. I told myself I was giving her something better than what I had taken. I told myself that was close enough to making it right. He looked at the paper. It was not close enough. It was not even in the same territory as right. I said, "She wants to speak to you, but I need to know something first. I need to know about Wade Holt." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. August went very still. I said, "Silas told me the name. I have been carrying it for 3 days. I need to hear what you know about what happened to Thomas Dalloway from you. Not from anyone else. From you." August looked at his hands on the desk. They were old hands, large-knuckled, marked by decades of real work alongside his men. Whatever else my father was, he had always worked beside the people who worked for him. I had always respected that. I respected it still, even now, even in this room. He said Wade Holt came to me in the fall of 1864. He was a hired man of a particular kind, the kind that valleys like this one always had too many of in those years. Men who solved problems with methods that left no clear accounting. He said Thomas had hired him to run a survey of the water rights property, and that during the survey he had found something. Evidence, he said, that Thomas intended to contest our partnership agreement in court. He paused. He picked up the cold coffee and set it down again without drinking it. He said, "I told Holt I wanted Thomas gone from the valley. I meant I wanted him bought out or scared off or persuaded to take money and leave. I was angry. I said words that could be understood in more than one way by a man who operated the way Holt operated. And then I left for Billings for 2 weeks on business, and when I came back, Thomas Dalloway was dead. I said, "And Holt." He said Holt came to me and told me what he had done. He wanted money. He wanted enough money to disappear and enough of my silence to make the disappearance permanent. He looked at me. I gave him both. The room was very quiet. I said, "You have been living with that for 22 years. He said, "Yes." I said, "And the water rights?" He said, "After Thomas died, the partnership dissolved. His half reverted to me under the terms of the original agreement. It was all legal, every piece of paper in order. Legal does not mean right. I knew that then. I know it more now." I looked at my father across the desk. This man I had been trying to understand my entire life, this man who had built something enormous and then spent decades being slowly hollowed out by what he had built it on, and I thought about what it costs to carry a thing like that. Not the dramatic cost of sleepless nights and haunted expressions, the quiet daily cost of it, the way it gets into everything, the way it colors how you see yourself until you can no longer find the line between who you were before and who the secret made you. I said, "There is a way through this, but it requires you to do things you are not going to want to do." He said, "Tell me." I said, "You are going to tell Cord Dalloway everything you just told me. You are going to give him every piece of information you have about Wade Holt, wherever he went, whatever name he is using, everything. You are going to cooperate fully with whatever investigation follows." August said, "That will end this ranch." I said, "It will change this ranch." "That is not the same thing." He said, "Rowan." I said, "The water rights will be redistributed. A fair agreement, the kind Thomas wanted in the first place, shared access for every ranch in the Western Valley. That is not negotiable." He said, "You are asking me to give away the thing this ranch was built around." I said, "I am asking you to give back the thing it was built on top of. There is a difference." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "And the girl, Clara." I said, "You will speak to her directly. You will tell her the truth about her father. You will not manage it or soften it in ways that serve your conscience at the expense of her understanding. She has a right to know who Thomas Dalloway was and what he stood for and how he died, and she has a right to hear it from the man who knows it best." August was quiet. The morning had advanced around us, and the study was fully lit now, the dust settling in the light, the ledger still open and unread on the desk. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a very long drop, looking down, calculating not whether to fall, but whether he has the nerve to step back from the edge and walk the long way around instead. He said, "She will hate me." I said, "I do not know what she will feel. But I know that the only thing worse than her knowing the truth is her not knowing it. You have made that choice once already. I am asking you not to make it again." He looked at the paper on the desk. He looked at his hands. He looked at the window where the morning light was clear and clean and entirely indifferent to what was being decided in the room beneath it. He said, "All right." He said it quietly, without drama. The way you say something when you have been arguing against it for a long time inside yourself and have finally run out of arguments. He said, "Send her in." I went to find Clara. She was in the barn, which was where she went when she was thinking. She had her hands busy with a bridle that needed oiling, the kind of work that keeps the hands occupied while the mind goes where it needs to go. She looked up when I came in and read my face the way she had learned to read it over the last several weeks, directly and without flinching. She said, "He will speak to me." I said, "He is waiting for you now." She set down the bridle. She wiped her hands on the cloth she kept in her pocket. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone gathering themselves for something they have been both dreading and needing in equal measure. She said, "Will you come with me?" I said, "If you want me there." She said, "I want you there." We walked to the house together. What happened in that study for the next hour is something I will carry the rest of my life. Not because it was violent or dramatic or operatic in the way that certain kinds of reckoning are. It was none of those things. It was quiet, and it was complete, and it had the particular weight of something that has been held under pressure for a very long time, finally being allowed to surface. August told Clara the truth about her father, all of it, the partnership, The argument over the water. Thomas Dalloway's intention to share the tributary with every ranch in the valley because he believed that water belonged to the community that depended on it and not to the man who happened to hold the deed. The winter of 1865. Wade Holt. What August had said, and what he had not said, and what had happened while he was in Billings, and what he had done when he came back and found it done. Clara sat across from my father and listened with the stillness of someone who has trained herself not to react until she has understood. I sat beside her, not touching her present. When August finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He wanted to share the water." August said, "Yes, that was always what he wanted. From the beginning." She said, "And that was why he had to be removed." August said, "In the reasoning of a man who had let himself believe that what he owned was more important than how he came to own it." "Yes." She looked at him. She said, "I am not going to tell you that I forgive you. I do not know yet if that is something I am capable of. But I am going to tell you something else. My father died trying to do the right thing. You have lived 22 years trying not to think about that. Now you are going to live whatever time you have left doing the thing he tried to do. That is not forgiveness. That is just the only thing that makes any sense to me right now." August looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at the desk, and something in his face, something that had been held rigid for 22 years, released. Not dramatically, just a settling like ground after a long freeze finally gives way to thaw. He said, "Your father would have liked you very much." Clara said nothing, but I saw her swallow once hard and look at the window, and I understood that she was holding something back that she would deal with later in private, in the way she dealt with the things that mattered most. I reached across and put my hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. She turned her hand over and held mine. She did not look at me, but she held on. That afternoon I sent Hattie to fetch Cord Dalloway, and then because there was one more piece that needed to be in the room when the sheriff arrived, Hattie went somewhere else first. Dalloway arrived at 4 in the afternoon. He came alone without the formal apparatus of law, without the trappings of an official visit. He came the way a man comes when he has been told something that made him set everything else down and ride directly without stopping to think about procedure or protocol. His horse was breathing hard when he came through the gate. He dismounted and handed the reins to the stable hand without looking at them and walked toward the house with the focused, slightly unsteady movement of someone who is managing a large interior event with imperfect success. I met him on the porch. He looked at me and said, "Hattie said Clara is here." I said, "She is inside. There is something you need to know before you see her." "There are several things." He said, "Tell me." I told him. Standing on the porch in the late afternoon light, I laid out everything I knew. Everything August had told Clara that morning, the partnership with Thomas, the argument Wade Holt the winter of 1865, the money paid to Catherine Vane to disappear into a different name and a different family and never speak of it again. I told it straight through without pausing, and Dalloway stood and listened with his hat in his hands and his face doing the work of a man receiving confirmation of something he has suspected for years, and finding that confirmation is not the relief he imagined it would be. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. He said, "I have been looking for this for 3 years." I said, "I know." He said, "I kept thinking there was a document somewhere, a record, something I could bring to a judge." I said, "My father will testify to everything. He will give you Wade Holt's name and every piece of information he has about where Holt went and what he was paid. He will cooperate fully with whatever investigation you need to conduct." Dalloway looked at me with the direct assessing gaze of a man who has been lied to enough times to be careful with sudden offers of cooperation. I said, "He is dying. He has 2 months, maybe 3. He wants to die without this on him. That is the honest reason, and it is the reason I am telling you instead of the more dignified one." Dalloway nodded slowly. He said, "And Clara?" I said, "She knows everything. She heard it from my father this morning. She is inside. And there is someone else here who needs to see her. Someone Hattie went to bring." He said, "Who?" I said, "Come inside." We went into the parlor. Clara was there, sitting in the chair near the window with the stillness she wore when she had been through something large and was in the process of integrating it. She looked up when Dalloway came in, and I watched her take him in the lean, weathered face, the deep-set eyes, the particular quality of his attention, and I watched something flicker in her expression as she registered that he was looking at her the way he had looked at her that first day in the yard, with that complicated internal weather recognition pressing against a framework not built to receive it. She stood up. Dalloway stopped in the middle of the room. He was looking at her the way you look at someone who is both a stranger and not a stranger, someone who belongs to a category of person you have been looking for without a face to attach to the category. He said, "You have your father's eyes." Clara said, "You knew him." He said, "He was my brother." The room was very still. I stood near the door and did not move. Clara looked at this man who was her father's brother, her blood, the person who had spent 22 years looking for the truth of what had happened to his family, and I watched her face do something I had not seen it do before. Not breaking down, not overwhelming, something more controlled and more complete than either of those things. The look of someone receiving something they did not know they had been hoping for until the moment it arrived. She said, "I did not know Thomas Dalloway had a brother." Dalloway said, "He did not talk about his family much. We had a falling out years before he died. I was too proud to mend it before it was too late." He stopped. He swallowed. He said, "When he died, I did not find out for 3 months. I was working in Wyoming. By the time I came back to look for Catherine and the child, they were gone. No one knew where. Or they knew and would not say." Clara said, "My mother died 4 years ago. She never told me who my father was. Dalloway said, 'She was protecting you. She thought the secret was protecting you.'" Clara said, "I know. She said so in her notebook." Dalloway took a step toward her and stopped himself, the instinct to close the distance running up against the understanding that she needed to set the pace of this, that he did not have the right to move faster than she was ready for. He said, "I am sorry. For all of it. For the time lost. For the truth kept from you. For the years you spent not knowing." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You spent 3 years trying to find it. That matters." He said, "It is not enough." She said, "No, but it is something." They stood across the room from each other. Uncle and niece, strangers who were not strangers. 2 people connected by a man who had died trying to do the right thing and whose absence had shaped both their lives in ways they were only now beginning to be able to see clearly. Then the door opened and Hattie came in. She came in with a woman behind her. The woman was perhaps 55, thin and upright, with white hair pulled back simply, and the quality of someone who has lived long in a particular kind of quiet, the quiet of someone who has made a decision about how to endure and has kept to it. She moved carefully the way you move when you are in a place that holds significance, and you are aware of the significance. She looked at Clara. Clara looked at her. Dalloway made a sound. Not a word. Something below the level of language. He knew her. I could see it in the way he went still, the way a man goes still when he sees something he had given up expecting to see again. Hattie said, "This is Nora, Catherine's sister, your mother's sister Clara. She was there the night you were born, and she has been living quietly at the edge of this valley for 20 years, waiting for the day she could say your name to your face. I have known where she was for 15 years. I knew where she was, and I knew what she carried, and I knew that bringing her here too soon would only have given August one more thing to bury." She looked at me briefly across the room, then back at Clara. But a house changes when the right person walks into it. This house changed 3 weeks ago. I have been watching it change every morning since. She settled her hands in front of her with the finality of someone completing a task that has taken a very long time. Nora has been waiting to be brought here for 15 years. She deserved to come to a house that was ready to receive her. I believe it is ready now. Nora Dalloway crossed the room. She did not stop at a polite distance. She walked directly to Clara and stood in front of her, and looked at her face the way you look at something you have been holding in your memory for a very long time and are now measuring against the reality. She said, "I held you once, when you were 4 days old, before your mother and I were separated." Clara said nothing. She was very still. Nora said, "You look like him, around the eyes and the way you hold your chin." He held his chin the same way when he was thinking something through, like he was bracing for whatever the answer was going to be. Clara's composure, which had held through everything that day, through her father's confession and the revelation of her blood and the meeting with the uncle she had never known, came apart very quietly and very completely, not in the way of breaking, but in the way of a long-held breath finally released. She put her hand over her mouth. She closed her eyes. Her shoulders went forward slightly, just slightly, and Nora Dalloway put her arms around her niece-in-law and held her, and Clara let herself be held. I looked at the floor. I looked at the window. I gave them the privacy of not being observed. Cord Dalloway was looking at the window too. His face was wet. He did not try to hide it. Hattie caught my eye from across the room and gave me the smallest nod, the gesture of a woman who has been waiting a very long time for a particular thing to happen and has finally seen it happen and considers the waiting to have been worth it. August came in near 5 o'clock. He came slowly, his cane on the floor and one hand on the doorframe, the diminished physical presence of a man near the end of his body's ability to do what he asks of it. He came into the parlor and looked at the people assembled in it, his son and the woman. His son had brought home the sheriff he had been evading for 3 years, the woman he had paid to disappear 2 decades ago, now standing in his parlor with her arms around the daughter of the man he had not protected. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then he walked to Cord Dalloway. He stood in front of him. He said, "I have a statement to give you. I want to do it today in this house in front of these people, not in a courthouse. Here." Dalloway looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." What followed was the most difficult hour I have ever witnessed in any room. August sat in the chair by the window, and Dalloway sat across from him, and my father spoke clearly and without evasion the full account of what he had said and done and known and chosen not to say in the winter of 1865. He named Wade Holt. He described the arrangement. He described what he had known and when he had known it, and what he had chosen to do with the knowing. He left nothing softened. He did not reach for the mitigating circumstances he could easily have reached for. He gave the account of a man who has decided that the manner of his dying matters to him. Clara sat through it. I sat beside her. When it was over, she did not speak for a long time. Then she said, "He described my father as a good man." I said yes. She said, "Rowan." I said yes. She said, "I am glad I know." 3 days passed. They were not quiet days. Dalloway filed the formal investigation paperwork. The water rights dispute, which had been whispered about in the valley for years, became an official matter of record. 2 other ranchers who had been waiting for the right moment came forward with documentation of their own smaller grievances, the accumulated evidence of 20 years of a single family holding more than its share of a common resource. The legal machinery of the Montana Territory moved slowly, but it moved, and the shape of what was coming began to be visible through the procedural language of official correspondence. August signed the preliminary agreement on the water rights redistribution on the 2nd day. His hand shook when he signed it. He did not stop until it was done. 6 weeks after Dalloway filed his paperwork, a deputy from Wyoming rode into the county with news. Wade Holt had been found living under the name Walter Greer outside Cheyenne, working as a hired hand on a sheep ranch. He had been brought in without incident. He was an old man by then, older than the crime that had been following him, and he did not fight it. Dalloway told me about it on a Tuesday morning, standing in our yard with the same quiet face he always wore. He said, "It will not bring Thomas back." I said, "No, but it closes something." He said, "Yes, it does that." He put his hat back on and rode out through the gate, and I stood in the yard for a moment thinking about a man who had spent 22 years running from something that was always exactly as far behind him as his own shadow. August heard the news that same afternoon. He did not say anything. He sat in his study until supper, and when he came to the table, his face had the particular quality of someone who has been carrying a door for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. On the 3rd evening, Delia Vane arrived at the ranch. She came on horseback alone with a small bag over the saddle horn, and when she rode through the gate, Her face had the expression of someone who has made a decision. They are not entirely sure is the right one, but are entirely sure they cannot unmake. She dismounted and looked at the main house, and then looked at Clara, who had come out to the yard when she heard the horse. They looked at each other across the yard. Delia said, "I did not know where else to go. Father sold the property. There is nothing left there." She paused. "And I thought." She stopped. Started again. "I thought that if you could do it, I could do it. Leave, and find out what comes next." Clara looked at her sister for a long moment. Then she walked across the yard, and Delia met her halfway, and they stood in the middle of the yard, and Delia put her head on Clara's shoulder, and Clara put her arm around her, and they stood there in the early evening light, two women who had come from the same difficult place by different difficult roads and had somehow ended up within arm's reach of each other. I watched from the porch and thought about inheritance. What we inherit that we did not earn, and what we earn that we did not inherit, and how rarely those two things come cleanly sorted. Silas appeared beside me. He looked at the two women in the yard. He said, "That one nodding toward Delia has a good eye for detail." I watched her look at the fence lines when she rode in. She noticed the section we repaired last week. I said, "Is that right?" He said, "Seems a shame to waste a talent like that." I said, "It does." He went back inside. I stood on the porch and watched the evening come over the valley, the long, slow, golden withdrawal of the light from the grass and the hills and the surface of the creek visible in the distance. And I thought about what the land looks like when you are looking at it honestly, without the overlay of what you have told yourself it means. It looked like itself, wide and real and indifferent to ownership in the way that land always is underneath the lines we draw on it, and the papers we file, and the arguments we conduct about what belongs to whom. It had been here before August Mercer, and it would be here after. What we did on it was the only thing that was truly ours. On the fourth morning after everything had been said in the study and the parlor and at the kitchen table, I found myself standing at the top of the long rise that looked north over the full extent of the Mercer property. I had ridden up there without quite deciding to the horse finding the familiar trail while my mind was elsewhere. Clara rode up beside me a few minutes later. She had seen me go and followed, which was the kind of thing she had begun to do without announcing it, a quiet presence that tracked where I was without requiring anything from me. I had come to value it in a way I had not valued the company of another person in years. We stood at the top of the rise and looked down at everything. She said, "It is still beautiful." I said, "Yes." She said, "Complicated things can still be beautiful." I think I used to believe you had to resolve the complication before you were allowed to see the beauty. I do not think that anymore. I looked at her. The morning light was on her face, and she was looking at the valley below with the expression she wore when she was fully present in something, not managing it, not standing apart from it, just in it. I said, "Clara." She turned to look at me. I said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it clearly so there is no ambiguity about it." She waited. I said, "I came to your father's property 6 months ago, carrying a piece of paper I should have burned, and a question I did not know how to ask, and I looked through a window and saw a woman who was real, in a way I had stopped believing people were. I chose you for reasons that were complicated, and not all of them were ones I was proud of in the way I handled them. But somewhere in the middle of everything that has happened since, somewhere between the barn at midnight and the kitchen table and the study this week and this hillside this morning, the reason became simple. I choose you because I want to, not because of a contract or a piece of paper or a debt anyone owes anyone else, just because you are the person I want to stand next to for however long I get." She was quiet for a moment. The wind came up the hillside and moved through the grass around us. She said, "When I was sitting in your father's study, listening to him tell me about my father, I kept waiting to feel like the ground was gone, like everything was too complicated to stand on." She paused. "But I could feel you on my left side the whole time. Just there, not trying to make it easier or manage what I felt. Just there." I said, "Yes." She said, "I have never had that before. Someone just being there without needing something from it." I said, "I know." She looked at me steadily with the clear and patient attention she gave to everything worth understanding. She said, "I choose you too. I want that said as plainly as you said yours. Not because I have nowhere else to go, not because the circumstances made it sensible, but because you are the first person who gave me a room in which I could be entirely myself and then stayed in the room." She reached out and put her hand in mine. We stood at the top of the rise with the valley spread below us, the creek catching the morning light in the distance, the property that would soon look different on the official maps of the Montana Territory, smaller in its claim on the water, larger in what it could honestly say it was. In the ranch below, Delia Vane was sitting at the kitchen table with Silas's ledger books, her eye for detail finally being applied to something that belonged to her choices rather than her obligations. Nora Dalloway was staying in the East Wing for the week, telling Clara stories about a man who had held his chin a certain way when he was thinking things through. Cord Dalloway was in the county seat filing paperwork that had been 22 years in the filing, and August Mercer was in his study not looking at the window this time, writing a letter to every rancher in the Western Valley whose crops had suffered in dry years because of a decision he had made in the winter of 1865. Not asking for forgiveness, not explaining, just acknowledging in the plain language of a man who has stopped hiding what had been taken and what was being returned. I held Clara's hand at the top of the rise and looked at the land below and thought about what Hattie had said years ago on a morning I had not thought about in a long time. She had said, "The land remembers everything that happens on it, Rowan. Every decision, every kindness, every wrong. You cannot change what it remembers. You can only change what you give it to remember next." I had not understood what she meant then. I understood it now. The creek ran through the valley below water that had been held and was now being returned, moving the way water always moves, finding the course of least resistance, filling what was empty, feeding what was dry, indifferent to the arguments of men, and entirely patient with the slow work of restoration. Clara stood beside me and looked at it. She said, "It is good water." I said, "Yes." She said, "My father was right. It does not belong to one person." I said, "No, it never did." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do we do now?" I said, "We go down there. We do the work. We build something worth building." She looked at me. Something in her face, some last held-back thing, finally let go. Not in grief, in arrival. The expression of someone who has been traveling for a very long time and has finally recognized the place they were traveling toward. She said, "Then let us go." We rode down from the rise together into the valley, into the morning, into everything that came next. The land remembered all of it, every word spoken in the study, every silence held in the barn, every hand extended across a table, across a room, across the long distance between what a family had been and what it was choosing to become. It remembered the man who had died trying to share the water, and it remembered the morning his daughter rode down from the hill with her hand in the hand of the man who had finally opened the door. That was what we gave it to remember. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.